Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. I'm really happy to be here. It was my fault that the webinar got moved. Just sorry. I just got back from Madagascar, and if you're curious, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But today we're going to be talking about climate change refugia conservation. And I was very interested to hear the results of the poll. I think that you'll be happy with this presentation and its focus, or this hour and its focus. I will say that this presentation is more focused on adaptation and kind of what we can do about the impacts of climate change, and a little less on the counting up the impact side. So hopefully that's good news. So I am Toni Morelli with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. The CASC is hosted by University of Massachusetts. We're located in Western Massachusetts. We are the Climate Adaptation Science Centers are partnerships between USGS and university consortia. And so we work closely with students and postdocs in the work we do, and you hopefully are already familiar with us, but you can find lots of information and projects and results and tools on our website. So because we're going to be talking in this hour about climate change adaptation, I thought I would give a little quick primer of how many of us think about climate change adaptation, kind of taxonomy, and this was actually developed by Forest Service scientists thinking about transition, resilience, and resistance. So there are these sort of three big bins you can think about of ways that we can manage the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and species. One is maybe the most drastic, thinking about enabling transition to change. So to do that, you might promote connectivity, diversify seed sources, even move species around so that that new system can come in. What we talk here most frequently about is resilience strategies, although in kind of general pop culture, that term is very broad. In this specific context, resilience is really about helping a system to be able to bounce back from a disturbance or a stressor. So you can think about doing that in terms of forest thinning or restoration of incised banks, or even these strategies also can be applied to sociocultural resources. So you can think about making snow at ski areas like we have to when it's 55 degrees in Massachusetts in February and March, early March. But today we're going to be talking about a strategy that more falls along the idea of resistance. So really trying to push back on the impacts of climate change as much as possible. So you could do that through reducing disturbances, through fire breaks, intense removal of migrants, something that we're thinking a lot about in my research group. And really the most common tactic for that is conserving climate change refugia. And refugia have been more and more coming up in the literature. This is a concept that started with paleoecological studies decades and decades and decades ago, but has been recently borrowed into thinking about climate adaptation and conservation, so in this sort of modern context. And here's just one of those little bar graphs to say, this one's from Web of Knowledge, saying, yeah, the idea of climate refugia or climate change refugia has been really increasing in recent years. This idea is more and more a focus. A group of us, managers and researchers, scientists from federal agencies and scientists from academia, managers from both federal and state agencies came together about a decade ago and really tried to come out with a operational concept definition of climate change refugia. And so we published this paper in PLOS One, and this is the definition that I'll be working with today of climate change refugia. This is areas relatively buffered from contemporary climate change. So this anthropogenic current climate change that enable persistence of valued physical, ecological, and sociocultural resources. So most of us think about species or ecosystems, habitats, but again, this can apply to other resources like downhill skiing as well. if you're trying to identify climate change refugia in an area that you don't have a lot of data on, you can imagine that there are some like kind of first principles of where you might find them. So where there's more topographic complexity, you could expect to be able to find climate change refugia. Where there's more snow, where there are cold air pools, which means basically the air is decoupled from the local climate conditions and it's colder down than up. Areas with large deep lakes or deeper streams are expected to be colder. And then of course related to seeps or springs. So you can imagine that thinking about sort of the landscape where you would find refugia. What we did in this paper was to develop a conservation cycle. This should look familiar because it's borrowed from the Climate Smart cycle, as well as that being borrowed from the adaptive management cycle. So it's all sort of the same idea where you start with thinking about your objectives, and then you do a vulnerability assessment. How are those resources you care about, those species you care about, impacted by climate change? And in that, you revise your goals, and can you then identify some part of their life history or some part of their geography in which essentially the temperature or the precipitation might be different than other places in particular areas, and you could identify refugia there. So we'll talk a lot. I'll talk most about this identifying and mapping refugia, but really where the rubber hits the road is thinking about what you then do in those places. And so thinking about the opportunities for conservation and management in priority areas. So these are not necessarily new tools for refugia, but the refugia acts as a way to prioritize where you would otherwise want to be doing actions. There's recent work. We actually have a special issue coming out in a journal in June, looking at particular kinds of refugia. So I'm gonna walk quickly through those, and then we'll hear more about that later in the hour. So you can imagine hydrological refugia, places, seeps or springs out west where things are very dry, and those places can really help particular populations or even species to persist despite really dry conditions around in the surrounding area. Lately, we've also been thinking about disturbance refugia. So this is a really interesting one, kind of thinking about places that are not burning as much, or not being as affected by drought, or not being as affected by, for example, forest pests. And so there's a paper coming out in a special issue thinking about, can we identify these places? Becca, we're lucky to have on the presenting today, is a co-author on another paper thinking about Coldwater Refugia. So she'll talk about this some more. So thinking about, for example, coldwater stream refugia and how those might act as particular stream reaches might act in a network to act as refugium for fish species or other species. And then another way to think about another sort of taxonomy of refugia, or thinking about vegetative refugia. Those have been mapped by Jim Thorne and others to say where are the places where the vegetative community seems to stay the same into the future, looking at climate projections. If so, you can then expect that maybe the fauna that depend on them will. Finally, and I'd be happy to talk about this later, it's the kind of the newest idea in the work we're doing is, although I did start by saying this is a resistance strategy, you can imagine that there are places that will start out as refugia for moose, for example, in the Northeast. And even though they warm slower than another place that maybe transitions over to white-tailed deer quicker, or out of moose climate niche quicker, this refugia might, given enough time, will still warm too much, given that right now, at least, climate change seems to be fairly unidirectional, but might still be able to support species that another place would be too cold for. So we can really think of this as a landscape approach to climate adaptation. So to bring back to the cycle, I just wanted to use an example from out west where we've gone through this whole process, and then I will tell you about some work that's been happening in the Northeast where we haven't gone all the way through, but we've done a lot of work on the ground to kind of identify priorities and start to map them. So I did work in the Sierra Nevada, in Yosemite, and across California. This is recently been a very hot, very dry place, as I'm sure you've heard. And we had managers that were really concerned, particularly about montane meadows. So they kind of identified that was their planning purpose and objective, is to focus on montane meadows. And we then wanted to see if we could map the refugial meadows. And we had great data on meadows, 10,000 meadows across the Sierra Nevada, and we were able to then use climate modeling to say, in fact, from the past, to look at how these meadows had changed or not over the 100-year period. And so in blue are the meadows that increase less than 1 degree Celsius in temperature, annual average, or in max temperature or min temperature or in annual precipitation. And we actually did this work kind of across a bunch of different slices of temperature and precipitation variables, because depending on whether you care about Yosemite toad or you care about a particular raptor species, you might have a different cue that species is using, or niche that it needs in terms of the climate it needs for its habitat. And so we did this Refugia map, but important to this process is then to actually test it, because these climate data are coarse, they have uncertainty in them, there's errors, there's problems. We want to make sure that there's a lot of assumptions. We want to make sure the species are actually responding to the same things that we think they are. And so we actually used an independent data set that I gathered on the Belding's ground squirrel, which is a montane meadow inhabitant in the Sierra Nevada. And we looked at where they were 100 years ago and whether they were, what the meadows that they had persisted in. So we had this great data set. We were able to do occupancy analysis by doing resurveys at these meadows to say, okay, here are the sites, these 43 where the Belding's ground squirrel is still here after 100 years. It's really a remarkable loss that this area has seen of this species. And we could then focus on sort of what is the difference in those sites between the ones where they've disappeared, they've been extirpated, and the ones they've persisted. So we were able to compare that independent data set to the one where we had of the Refugia meadows, and in fact found that the meadows that we had defined as Refugia were actually the ones where the Beldings had persisted. So the Beldings were telling us yes, validating our Refugia map. So we were able to get all the way around here then by going back to the managers and talking to them about what would you do in a meadow if you knew that it was going to be more buffered from climate change? Are there other ways you can conserve it? And so we have some of those here. There's also other things that you would do, other reasons to prioritize these areas. So of course, Refugia is not the only thing that the managers care about. There's other important aspects as well. So it's just like another layer you can imagine in the GIS where you say, okay, this one's Refugial, okay, and that another layer that says this has species of greatest conservation concern or something. And so you can kind of put all that information together to decide where are you gonna go treat invasives next, for example, or deal with road and trail issues. And so here's just some of the things that we talked about in that group of sort of what can we do about conserving these areas. And in fact, this has been used by the Invasive Plant Council out in California to do meadow restoration in particular areas. They couldn't restore 10,000 meadows. And so they use this information to focus and prioritize their restoration. Other work that's going to be published in the special issue, and some of it has already come out, is looking at conservation in Joshua Tree National Park. So this really cool interaction between fire, invasives, and these important native species, Joshua trees. And if you can show, using citizen science, they showed that the places where Joshua Cedar trees were still growing, and overlaying that to show where has been places that they haven't been as, they've been buffered more by fire. And to then the action being to treat for invasive species. Another project that I mentioned with the mapping of the vegetative climate refugia, that work has been used by the state of California to then say, okay, well, these certain particular bird species we care about, here's the places where we think they're going to have refugia in the future. And again, that could be used to prioritize restoration treatments or other management. There's a work out in Southwest Colorado where they've actually done on-the-ground data to look at regeneration of conifers and use that to identify refugia. And then once those refugia are identified, they can then protect them with all these different ways that they have discussed here. And so it's really interesting the different ways that this is starting to get momentum, and managers and scientists working together to really act in the face of climate change. There's similar work actually happening in Minnesota where they've identified refugia and used that to use millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to protect deep refugial lakes. And the lakes themselves are, one of the co-benefits is clean water for people. So they're protecting land in order to prevent pollution, and those lakes are more protected. And likewise in Minnesota, they're looking at where conifer strongholds are, so protecting refugia for conifers. So that's sort of the work outside of the Northeast proper. We had a meeting a couple years ago where we brought a lot of people together, and we had a conversation about what are the priorities for the Northeastern US in terms of refugia. This list probably doesn't surprise you if you're in the Northeast. And we're gearing up to do another workshop, which I'll talk about in just a second. The one I wanted to tell you is that the next step after this, after we had that first kind of priority brainstorm, was that we did a more narrow project, but one of the first in the country for our National Park Service. So we focus on Acadia National Park. This is work by Jenny Smetzer, funding through Skudik Institute, the Second Century Fellowship. And we workshopped with Acadia managers and people in the region to say, like, what species would you like to see conserved and mapped refugia for? So this is all publicly available. You can go to this website. I just wanted to show you that Jenny did this amazing work, and you can see the handful of species that ended up floating up to the top for people. Some were actually because they were cultural species, culturally important, either for tribal nations or for other reasons up in Maine. And then others that people thought were particularly vulnerable to climate change. And so just to zoom in, you can click on any of these species and you can see a map of where the species are expected to be in the future, that given that they are there now. And there's slider bars on all this, so you can kind of adjust for current occupancy. And then actually you can look at two different climate scenarios, 8.5 and 4.5. So in this one, looks like black-throated green warbler is still doing all right in the future, even in RCP 8.5, the higher emission scenario. On the other hand, you can see black crowberry, even with a low current occupancy threshold and middle of the road emission scenario, you can see they're still pretty rare. And if we compare that to 8.5, you can see that the species is mostly gone by 2080. And so you can imagine that the management might focus on those areas where it seems like the species is going to be doing the best if they're wanting it to persist in southern down east Maine. So I just wanted to tell you to wrap up that all of these data are available on the climaterefugia.org website. This is the website of the Refugia Research Coalition, which is just a sort of broad group that brings together people that are working on these issues and thinking about these issues. You can see that we have pages for all the different areas of most of the different areas of the US, as well as Boreal Canada. On the Northeast page, we have projects highlighted on these particular ecosystems, although we'll be moving into others as well. And I had mentioned that we have a special issue coming out. This is not a real cover. It's just my pretend cover, but it's real that it's happening. So in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, we'll be having a special issue come out, expected in June 2020, that will talk about the great work that I've been mentioning here, and that Becca will talk a little bit more about. I also want to let you know we have a workshop in 2 weeks, both in Amherst and in Patuxent, depending on where you are. It's particularly focused on National Park Service, but we're happy to have partners and other interested managers and scientists attend, because the National Park Service units in the Northeast are really small. They recognize they're part of a landscape of management and conservation. And the meeting on the 19th will have remote options available. So you can find more information at the climaterefugia.org website. And here's my email address. And now I'd like to pass off to Brian Hawthorne, who will be talking more about the work that's happening in Massachusetts, because there's really exciting things happening on the ground here. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Toni Lynn. So we'll let Brian get his PowerPoint loaded up. I see we have a question. We're going to hold off until the end. So in the meantime, Brian, take it away. And if folks have questions, please type them into the chat box, and we'll address them after the presentations conclude. Thanks.
All right, I'm hoping that everyone is now seeing the actual slide and not seeing my presenter notes. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right, great. I'm actually Becca's gonna start off our presentation, and I'm just gonna drive the slides for her, and then she'll hand it off to me when she's ready. Go ahead, Becca.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Toni Lynn. I'm basically gonna touch on how we are applying this concept of climate change refugia in our management. The MassWildlife as an agency has a long history of thinking about climate change and impacts. And until about 2018, really the emphasis had been on looking at vulnerability. So doing these vulnerability assessments at different levels, from ecosystem to habitats to species. And really now we're shifting more our focus to thinking about climate adaptation. What are the actions that are within our toolbox that we can use in order to protect the assets that we have as an agency? I do want to mention that we're also changing our thinking a little bit, and this talk is really representing that, in the sense that we're recognizing that the past efforts that we've had really dealt with either species specifically individually or habitats individually, and now we're starting to think about what are the kind of the nexus where these different ecosystems interact. And based on a 2010 report that was done by the Manomet Center, looking at the habitats in Massachusetts, they found that coldwater streams and rivers are probably some of the most vulnerable freshwater habitats. At the same time, they found that spruce fir and northern hardwood forests are some of the most vulnerable for forested habitats. So this talk is really talking about where we would apply climate change refugia concepts in areas where there's interaction between the forested and the freshwater habitats. Next slide, please. Can you do that for me, Ryan? Yes, and so really this is just to remind us what our mission here is at MassWildlife. The impetus for the work that we're doing is really due to the mission that we have to conserve all freshwater fish, wildlife, and plants, and really thinking about the actions that we use to do that, and those include restoration, protection, and management. So today, if we go to the next slide, I'm really focusing on freshwater fishes. And this is a map representing the fish database that we have here at MassWildlife. We're really lucky that we have an extensive data collection system. And since 1998, our surveys represented by each of these dots were fairly standardized. So we have this amazing data set. The dots, the colors represent red are areas where we found warm water fishes. Blue are areas where we found cold water species. And then there's other dots there. The black represents that at that point in time, we didn't find any fishes. And then we have some triangles for lakes and ponds. But really, if you go to the next slide, Brian, the blue dots represent what we think of, well, these are the areas where we know we have cold water species here. So this is kind of how we think about the potential for climate refugia, kind of the baseline. So here are, we're largely brook trout and slimy sculpin, and some of the other 11 species that are found in cold water are located. And the curiosity then went to where can we expect these areas to continue to function as cold water, particularly as summer temperatures increase. And in order to think about that problem, we started working closely within a larger group that included folks from the USGS Conte lab, the anadromous lab. They have been working for many years looking at these brook trout occupancy models. So the idea is, given landscape, climate, and land use characteristics in watersheds, what can we project into the future where brook trout are continue to be? And brook trout, of course, are indicator species for cold water. So although we focus on that, we recognize they represent kind of a larger group of species. And so we coupled our data with these models. And if you go to the next slide, we started to project forward if we had increases in July temperatures of 2 degrees, 4 degrees, and 6 degrees, what would these areas look like? And the red dots here represent those areas that would have been blue dots now, but now are perhaps too warm in the summer for brook trout to do well. That doesn't mean the brook trout have disappeared. They're just going to have a more challenging time. And so from what we have now to this 2-degree increase, it represents about a 42% drop in areas that we would have brook trout. If you continue to increase temperatures for the next slide, at a 4-degree, we have yet another 28% decrease. And so now we see that things are really shrinking, particularly in the eastern part of the state and central part of the state. And if we go one more slide, at 6 degrees, really we're looking at areas where we have higher elevations and forested landscapes. And that's really where that nexus came. We really wanted to touch base with our habitat managers, Brian representing that section, the folks that really manage the forest, to really think about, well, what do we do to protect these areas and keep them cold? And so I'll transition there to Brian.
Thanks, Becca. Let's see if I can get my slide up. There we go. All right, I've borrowed this slide from Toni Lynn's paper to help transition us towards thinking about the forests surrounding those potential cold water refugia in Massachusetts. One of the key impacts on cold water fisheries resources is the composition and status of the forest canopy. In order to consider the relationship of the cold water climate change refugia to the surrounding forests, we need to know what tree species might decline, where those tree species occur, and whether they co-occur with cold water refugia and cold water habitats in general. First question we had to answer is, what tree species are likely to be affected? So we looked at a few pieces of research. Rogers, Jansen, Goetz developed a spatially explicit climate change vulnerability analysis for 40 major tree species in the eastern United States. They created a species distribution model that includes range, prevalence, and variables such as soils, annual solar radiation, and topographic wetness. They then applied that model to downscaled climate projections, which allowed them to predict future habitat suitability, adaptive capacity, potential impact on the species, and vulnerability for each tree species at 3 time points, 2030, 2055, and 2080. They averaged those vulnerability scores for each species across the entire region and calculated forest type vulnerability as the average of the relevant species weighted by prevalence. So you can see here we have spruce fir, which includes our balsam fir and spruce species, which are some of the most vulnerable in their analysis. Because the analysis was completed for the entire US, however, applying these species rankings to just a small portion of the range with a subset of the species and forest types like Massachusetts could be problematic because we're looking at just a small portion of the variability. We didn't want to apply those conclusions specifically to our state. Fortunately, we have another analysis which looked at forests a little closer to home. Marie Janowiak, Toni D'Amato, and a cast of thousands, apparently, dozens at least, evaluated forest ecosystem vulnerability with a range of climate scenarios. This was in New England and northern New York. They summarized current conditions and stressors and modeled forest change based on projected trends in climate. They assessed 3 subregions in this analysis: the northern forest, eastern and coastal Maine, and southern and coastal New England. One of the products of that assessment was a list of climate change projections for individual tree species, which the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science turned into helpful 2-page summaries for the region as a whole and for the 3 subregions. The summaries break out results for 2 climate change scenarios and 2 simulation models and show which species were projected to increase or decrease by more than 20% by 2100. Also note the absence of American beech and sugar maple, or rather not the absence, but the, let me just find them here. American beech, you can see, is showing mixed results, and sugar maple, so American beech here and sugar maple here. These are showing mixed model results, especially in the northern forest subregion. Because of those mixed results, we've left them off of our species list for this analysis, and we'll need to do some further research on determining whether in Massachusetts those are species that are likely to be declining. Massachusetts is split between 2 of those subregions. Extracted here are the 10 tree species which are projected to decline in the northern forest. Note again the mixed model results in the subregion for quaking aspen and balsam fir, which that East Coast, or Eastern US rather, Rogers analysis had showed as the 2 most vulnerable species in the eastern forest overall. And here's the list for the southern and coastal New England subregion. Although there are some differences in the extent or likelihood of decline between the 2 subregions, the list of species is essentially the same. Once we've identified the tree species of interest, we need a way of determining where they occur. Finding a data source with a fine enough resolution was challenging. Although the National Land Cover Database maps the entire country at a 30-meter resolution, it provides just 3 forest types: deciduous, evergreen, and mixed. At the other extreme, the USDA Forest Service Climate Change Atlas provides models of current and forecast distribution of 134 tree species, but at a resolution of 20 kilometers. In between, we have the Forest Service network of forest inventory and analysis plots, which include all species on the plots, but has just 1 plot per 6,000 acres, which translates to a resolution of about 1,500 meters. And that Rogers analysis I mentioned at the beginning modeled 40 tree species at a resolution of 800 meters, which is better, but each of those pixels is still 64 hectares in size, which is too coarse to be useful in a small state like Massachusetts, where the average forest landholding is about 7 hectares. Fortunately, the USDA Forest Service Forest Health Technology Enterprise team created an updated National Individual Tree Species Atlas in 2015. They used measurements of tree species occurrence from the sparse network of FIA plots and then downsampled by modeling relationships between species basal area and predictor variables to produce a nationwide model of 264 tree species at a resolution of 240 meters. The predictor layers were derived from national data sets that included climate, elevation, soils, and Landsat imagery. The 240-meter resolution results in pixels that are just under 6 hectares in size, about the same scale as the average Massachusetts forest ownership. Before I go on, I should probably clarify for the non-foresters what basal area is. I've just mentioned that, and we'll use it again in the next few slides. It's a measurement of the cross-sectional area of the base of a tree. This is easy to calculate by measuring tree diameters, and you don't have to cut the trees down to get that measurement. Because it is closely correlated within a given forest stand with biomass and tree canopy, basal area is often used at the forest level as a proxy for dominance by species. It's usually expressed in the United States as square feet of tree basal area per acre of forest, or elsewhere as square meters per hectare. The individual tree species atlas model lumps all fir species together, all spruce species together, and all aspen species together, Also, two of the species on that list we had before, tamarack and northern white cedar, grow in relatively small stands, and they did not appear at a measurable percentage in any of the modeled 240-meter cells within Massachusetts. This leaves us with 6 species groups to consider. I want to draw your attention to eastern hemlock and eastern white pine, which are both listed as declining, especially in the southern and coastal region of Massachusetts. Eastern white pine is the #1 most common tree species by biomass in Massachusetts, and eastern hemlock is the #3. I'll get back to how we treated these a little bit later. Combining the percent basal area for the 6 tree species provides an estimate of the proportion of tree basal area in any pixel that's likely to be affected by climate change. Because white pine and hemlock are so widespread, you can see that just about every forested acre in the state is represented. On the right side are maps of all cells that met one of 3 thresholds for percent basal area and species predicted to decline. About half of the forest has 25% or more of these species. 21% of the forest has 50% or more, and 8% of the forest has 2/3 or more in species predicted to decline. Now that we know where the vulnerable tree species occur, we need to compare that map to our modeled Coldwater Refugia, as that refugia analysis is intended to identify points which are likely to continue to provide cold water habitat even with a rise in July temperature. We would expect that those points would occur outside of the most at-risk forest cells. In fact, only about 15% of the refugia points identified occurred within forests that met the 66% threshold. We see just about the same proportion of refugia points whether we consider a 2-degree, 4-degree, or 6-degree rise in July temperature. These results support the refugia analysis, suggesting that the forests around most of them are less likely to be subject to tree species declines. So how do the rest of our cold water fisheries resources fare? Based on stream sampling, Massachusetts has about 6,700 kilometers of streams and rivers mapped as cold water fisheries resources, or CFRs. These are concentrated in the less developed western half of the state. Adam Kautza, MassWildlife's Cold Water Fisheries project leader, was kind enough to share with me some work in progress that identifies reaches of our CFRs by abundance of eastern brook trout based on electrofishing survey data. About 1,050 kilometers of the CFRs are classified as Class B, and about 500 kilometers as Class A. Overlaying these classes of CFRs with forested cells that meet the 25%, 50%, or 66% thresholds for vulnerable tree species shows that for both CFRs overall and Class B CFRs, the proportion of streams within those cells mirrors the prevalence of the forest classes, suggesting that most CFRs are neither more nor less likely to be found within vulnerable forests than within forests in general. However, the results for the Class A CFRs are distinctly different. While forests containing 25% or more of vulnerable tree species represent just half of the total forested area in Massachusetts, over 95% of the length of Class A CFRs occurs within them, about twice as much as we might expect if the location of the CFRs was independent of forest tree species composition. Remember I said I'd get back to the question of eastern hemlock and eastern white pine. Because of the differing model results between the two subregions of Massachusetts, I considered leaving both species out. However, hemlock is already declining at lower elevations throughout the state due to hemlock woolly delgid and is beginning to decline in mid-elevation forests in the western part of the state. White pine was predicted to decline primarily in the southern and coastal region where we have fewer cold water fisheries resources. I was concerned that the predominance of this species as the most common species in the state might in some way be skewing the results of the analysis. So I repeated the analysis without eastern white pine. As shown here, there was of course much less forest that met the 25% threshold. However, the length of Class A CFRs occurring within this forest remained about twice as high as would be expected from the overall occurrence of forests with the remaining 5 species groups. So what can we do to conserve these climate change refugia? I wish I could give you a simple set of guidelines for managing forests to conserve cold water fisheries, but that remains a work in progress. There are many guides to managing for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency. These include the paper that our first speaker, Toni Morelli, discussed, which lays out the conceptual model and process for climate change refugia conservation. The Genowiak et al. Report that I've mentioned several times includes a chapter on management implications, which goes through specific types of management approaches, including planning, habitat management, wilderness management, land conservation, forest products, forest harvesting, recreation, and more. Each of these sections includes extensive resource lists for more information. Toni D'Amato's 2011 paper in Forest Ecology and Management looks at 5 long-term experiments and assessed the trade-offs between climate mitigation and climate adaptation approaches. And the Forest Resiliency publication by Paul Catanzaro, Anthony D'Amato, and Emily Silver-Huff, which is aimed at landowners, foresters, conservation organizations, and municipal officials, provides an overview of forest stressors, resiliency, and a framework for increasing forest resiliency. In addition to the resources for the overall planning and decision-making process, there are also excellent resources available to help develop management approaches. I mentioned the Climate Change Atlas before. Although their mapping was at too coarse a resolution for our planning purposes, the links to species information is excellent and easy to navigate. Finally, the Fire Effects Information System, which has been around for decades, continues to provide some of the best tree species information around. The sections on ecological characteristics and silviculture provide the details that one needs to tailor management activities in the face of climate change. And finally, as much as I love fish and working at the intersection of forests and Coldwater Refugia, my heart lies with the forests themselves. Now that we have downscaled models for the distribution of most of the major tree species in Massachusetts, we can refine our forest habitat maps for the next revision of our state wildlife action plan, begin the process of identifying climate refugia for the forest types most vulnerable to climate change in Massachusetts, spruce, fir, and northern hardwoods, and hopefully produce management guidelines for those refugia. And with that, I will pass it back to everyone else for questions.
Yeah, you can leave it on. You can leave that slide up if you'd like. It's a nice, nice picture to look at. Thank you, Brian, Becca, and Toni Lynn. This is very interesting. We have a few questions that have come in, and also some really good resources that have been plugged into the chat box. So, everybody, please turn to the chat box if you have a question that you'd like to have answered, and also if you want to check out links to some resources that have been mentioned. So the first question came in from David Morgan. I believe it was for Toni Lynn. He says, in addition to Jenny's, are there other good data sets on expected changes in species range, especially in the Northeast?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That is a specialty of mine. I actually did the National Climate Assessment, the recent report that came out in I guess it was 2018 now in November, but the NCA4, I was the lead author for the range shifts section, and I reviewed basically every paper that's come out in the last 5 or 10 years on the topic. There's less than you would expect in terms of, especially fine scale, but in general, kind of showing what's happened so far, and then thinking about what will happen in the future in the Northeast. It sort of depends on what particular ecosystem or species that you care about. I have a paper coming out on thinking about what forest mammals are going to do. There's recent work in the Gulf of Maine looking at the impacts there. And there is some broad information in that National Climate Assessment, the ecosystems chapter, as well as the Northeast chapter, although it's less focused on species and ecosystems. So I would say, I think it feels like there's more out there than when you start looking, and it gets pretty broad. But hopefully that's a few good leads. And if you have particular taxa you're thinking about, you can email me and I can track some things down.
Awesome, thank you. We had another question. I believe this one is for Becca, from Anna Johnson. She asks, could you explain how climate model temperature increases translates to water temperature increase, given complicating factors like forest canopy and groundwater impacts?
Yeah, so I did put in the chat box the link for the models, and it's a fantastic web page that you can look at the outputs for the models, but you can also dig in to look at what variables were used. And certainly it's basically a logistic mixed effects model, and it incorporates things like forest cover, and there's some other land use pieces like urbanization, and for groundwater, we recognize that that's kind of an area where we use proxy variables. We can't measure it directly at the moment. So superficial geology is used largely to represent groundwater. So with the idea that in areas where you have sandy soils, you're more likely to have groundwater inputs. That all being said, we have a proposal right now hoping to get some funding to link groundwater models to surface water models to largely drive the temperature models so that we can really understand how water flows and temperatures are going to be impacted into the future. So, so they have been considered. It's part of the models, but I know we have areas to improve upon, and we hope to do that starting this summer.
Got it. Thank you. Again, folks, please feel free to type questions into the chat box. All of these resources are going to be listed on the NIAC's webpage for this event, so you're not missing out. So this one was a question for all the speakers. Dominique says, I would like to hear the speaker's response to the recent paper by Brown et al., Nature Climate Change 2020, who stated, where climate refugia are forecast to persist until the end of this century, temperatures in these refuges are likely to exceed the acclimation capacity of many species, making them short-term hospices for biodiversity at best. Toni, Lynn, do you want to start us off with a reaction to that?
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if you saw me furiously typing, but I'm like, I should know about this paper. So I was trying to find it. So if you can send a link, that would be awesome. I'm not sure that particular one, but the idea is something that in fact, well, first of all, we've been hearing critiques about since we started publishing on this. And second, if you read, if not you, but if one, including our critics, read closely, you'll see you would see that we say the same thing. That refugia are not a panacea, that they are time limited. That's something that I always make sure that I try to make sure I say. I guess I didn't say it this time. One of the reasons that I actually, it's interesting that I'm actually moving a little bit away from that language is for the reason that I put this slide up really quickly. And this is in a way a response to that. So again, this is the idea that your classic refugium would be like, moose are in it, and the idea would be like moose would be in it forever. But we always knew that that isn't true. Things are warming so quickly and don't seem like there's, in terms of policy, that's going to change anytime soon. So we know that even the slow lane of refugia is going to warm. That said, there are species that are in other places that are not refugia that also need somewhere to go, or there's species that are moving up from the south that eventually even their new home will get too warm. And so it's sort of thinking about this funny space in between, like transitional refugia. So even if they're too cold for the brook trout, maybe they're cold enough for the cool water species 100 years from now. So that's just my quick response to that perspective. And so I would say I agree. And also there's this interesting nuance to it, but I'll have to see the paper. I don't know if Brian or Becca, you have another response.
Sure, I have something to add in there. As someone who studies tree species in forests primarily, one of the difficulties that my species of interest have is that they can't migrate very quickly. They can't just pick up their roots and walk uphill or walk north. So tree species migration tends to occur over the course of centuries. So anything that we can do to provide refugia for a slightly longer time can help to enable those species and forest types to still exist long enough that they might be able to continue to migrate.
Great, thank you. Becca, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
Awesome. I was just going to say, Dominique, I heard her say Dominique. I didn't realize it was you. So of course that way to be on top of things. I'm not at all surprised. Thanks for sending that. I'll look into it.
Awesome. We do have a few more minutes for folks if you want to take a question into the chat box and our speakers can address it. I know there's a lot of information to digest in this webinar, and I believe our speakers' contact info, we can also share that on the NIAC's website as well. We'll give folks another minute or so to type a question, and I think we still have some time. While we're waiting, I guess I have a question for Brian and Becca. So obviously the streams and so forth don't stop at the state boundaries. How much do you guys at MassWildlife get to interact with your counterparts in neighboring states?
Yeah, so I actually have a project going on with New Hampshire right now for a couple of reasons. One is because clearly the changes that we're expecting are going to happen on much larger scales, and we have many streams that we share. But due to the constraints of where we can do work, right now we're just looking at one additional watershed. That's the Manusic watershed in New Hampshire, with the idea that that is even going to be more refugia-y. It's a colder, higher latitude, so it's probably going to be more resistance for a longer period, and so that's kind of serving as a benchmark to the sites that I have here in Massachusetts.
And I'll just jump in and say, unfortunately, other than at meetings and conferences, I don't have a lot of interactions with folks in neighboring states. I did want to point out that although the analysis that I did was based in Massachusetts, all of the data sources that I used are nationwide and so could be replicated by anyone else in another state or region.
Great, thank you both. John Scanlon had a question. He asks, is there a place for non-native species such as Norway spruce to replace native species like hemlock threatened by invasive species like hemlock woolly adelgid?
Just for in the interests of full disclosure, I will point out to everyone that John is my supervisor, and trust him to jump in with a difficult question like this. It's a topic that a lot of people disagree about. If your focus is on protecting specific species that have specific habitat needs, one could make the argument that planting non-native species might be a way of providing some of those habitat benefits for animals or herbaceous species that might need those. My concern is that we don't know enough really about some of those non-native species, I think, to determine whether it would be a good idea to use them as replacements. Yes, Norway spruce is not currently considered to be invasive, but nonetheless, I look at the amount of work that I and other land managers do in Massachusetts with controlling non-native exotic species that were planted by our predecessors. So frequently when we are doing habitat management, we have to clear out autumn olive or multiflora rose. The reason it's there is that someone in the 1940s or 50s thought it would be a great idea to plant those to provide food sources or cover or browse for species that we were concerned about here. So I would just say it's possible. It's not something I would be comfortable doing without a lot more research.
Great, thank you. I think we'll take this as the last question from Alex Ashby, who asks, this is probably more of a question of economics, but what kind of scale is worth keeping as refugia? 5 acres, 50 acres? Like you mentioned, most landholders only own a small patch. And I'd love to hear that actually from each of you, from Becca in the context of cold water fisheries, and from Brian maybe in the context of forest, and from Toni Lynn for your broader context in working in other regions. So Becca, do you mind starting us off with that? What scale is worth keeping as refugia?
Sure. So you briefly mentioned the work that I'm going to be doing this summer, looking at cold water patches and streams. And really what that's trying to get to is refugia for what? So something that we discussed a lot in a bigger context here and with our collaborators is that we're really thinking about refugia from the standpoint of protecting populations. So there are multiple, venues that we need to explore in order to get that. And one of them is, well, how many patches of cold water are required in order to protect a population of brook trout, for instance. And so I don't have a handle on that really, because it has to do with like how big the cold water patch is, how distant they are from one another, how abundant or how much recruitment a particular population of the fish is having in specific areas. So I'm hoping to tease out some of those pieces, but I do not have an answer at this moment. But from the fish perspective, certainly individuals will benefit from, even the smallest cold water patch that they can get into in summer temperatures. And recognizing that the rest of the system will be cold enough throughout the rest of the year. So it's just enough, you know, to kind of hold them over so that when temperatures drop in the fall or into winter, that they can spread out and actually become a greater metapopulation. So terrible answer without specifics, but that's where we're going.
And I would follow on with a similar answer from the forest perspective. It really depends on what it is that you are looking at providing a refuge for. If you're looking at a rare plant that lives in the understory of a spruce fir forest, you might, 5 acres might be enough. An acre might be enough. On the other hand, if you're looking at providing habitat for a wide-ranging mammalian species, bobcat or something like that, even 50 acres may not be enough. You may be looking at hundreds of acres of forest that's necessary for that. So I would encourage people to consider what do they have, if so landowners, what might they have on their land? If they only own 5 acres and they go out and do a bio blitz using iNaturalist or something and find out what they actually have, what are the habitat requirements for those specific species? And they may find that 5 acres is enough, or they may have to group together with their neighbors to build up a little bit more.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better than they did. I would just add that even those like broad-ranging mammals, refugia haven't been mapped for many mammals, but one study from USGS looked at wolverine habitat, and wolverines range for hundreds of kilometers, but they need a certain depth of snow for denning. And so you could actually imagine that you could create these little small patches that had den habitat, enough snow for denning habitat or something, that even for a species that ranges for hundreds of kilometers. So yeah, unfortunately, unsatisfyingly, the answer is it depends. But thanks for the questions, everyone, and for the attendance.
Yeah, thank you. So we are just a minute after the top of the hour. I am pasting into the chat box a link to the SAS Certificate of Credit Assignment. Please join me in a virtual round of applause for all of our presenters. This is really awesome. We really appreciate your taking the time to be a part of this. Again, the webinar recording will be posted on the NIAX website. And you can also find links to past recordings and register for additional webinars in the series. The next one, remember, is at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern, not at noon like the rest of the series. So hope you're able to join us at the right time. And thanks everyone for joining us.